My name is Nora Mulready and I am the founder of the Unfinished Revolution project. The Unfinished Revolution project takes the form of a series of short films looking explicitly at issues that are contentious, difficult to talk about, and have perhaps been shied away from by the political mainstream. To do this, we've brought together politicians, journalists, academics, campaigners, people with work and life experience in relation to the different topics that we're talking about. Today's film is exploring a highly controversial but really necessary topic, conservative Islam and liberal Britain. We hope you find it very thought-provoking and constructive. With me today, I have on my right here Amina, who is the co-director of the Social Action Foundation and a campaigner for women's rights and gender equality. And on my left, I have Andrew Copson, who is the chief executive of Humanists UK. Welcome. Start with you, Amina. Can you give us some definitions? What do we mean by conservative Islam?
Well, what my understanding of conservative Islam is a very orthodox interpretation of Islam, which is not mainstream, but which is being pushed and lobbied to become mainstream in Britain, in liberal Britain, and it is a liberal country. Conservative Islam has become synonymous with Islam in the UK, and actually that is one tiny version, just like you would have the Amish or you would have Orthodox Judaism or etc. But that seems to have become the mainstream, and I think that's one of the things I'd like to discuss is why has that become mainstream, and who's colluding with it, who's allowing it, who's enabling it, and what damage is that doing to our society and to integration, into cohesion, but also about the kind of society that we want to build.
For me, I think the institutions of liberal Britain that are enabling that are the media and the political establishment, successive governments.
Agree with you 100% on that.
Right.
Absolutely.
And I think that's different for different reasons. I think the media likes simple, easy narratives that it can, go to. It deals in stereotypes. It deals in black and white. It's easy for it to say, well, this is Islam, this is Muslims, here you go, here's a picture, and now in your head you know what it is, Britain. So that's, I think, one of the reasons. There are other reasons, but that's the main reason why the media, I think, is operating that way. Politician, I think, is a bit more difficult because it's a bit more complicated. There's lots of reasons why politicians have enabled this conservative Islam to be seen as the Islamic mainstream in Britain.
Myself and a number of other women, a very small group of us, basically had come together. We across the country, different backgrounds, all Muslim background, all Muslim identifying, of different ages, and come together. And we were basically seeing this increase of young girls, some very young, 3 or 4 years old, being covered in headscarves or in full jilbabs, in primary schools, in state primary schools,
right?
With nobody saying anything, and we just thought, look, we're coming to a tipping point here. Once you reach a certain critical mass, it becomes problematic, like it would with if we had a larger Orthodox Jewish community. The difference is it's very
suddenly
very small.
became normal.
It suddenly becomes normal, but it's a very small Orthodox Jewish community. But you have a very large Muslim minority communities in this country, and you've seen this increase that we never saw when I was at school, when they were at school, when the fourth generation were at school. So we said, look, this is a problem. Why isn't anybody addressing this?
But why is it a problem? Why do you see it as a problem?
Because it's un-Islamic. It is un-Islamic to cover girls from a young age. The covering issue, and you get the women who are often from a middle class background who wear hijab, who say, well, how dare you, it's my choice. Yeah, it's your choice, but there's a whole line of other women who don't have that choice, and they're usually very poor, from working class backgrounds, that have no say over their lives. And so if you indoctrinate somebody from a very young age, and I've interviewed so many people in the community, and they say, start them young, they won't rebel, because they want to act like you. And and they're very very open about saying that. They don't say that you're a bad person, but we don't want them to be like you, women like you, who are educated, to go off and get married of their own choice, or have free will, or don't get married horrifically. Do you know what I mean? And so they were saying it is about indoctrination and about modesty. It's about a woman having to cover because your beauty seems to be within your skin and in your hair, so you have to cover it because that should only be for your husband. So the younger you do that, the easier it is to then control that. So we were saying it's a problem. And it's a problem also because it's the mixed messages you're sending. What are you sending to young women, young girls, about their bodies, their sexuality, their identity? What are you saying to young boys about the women and women that cover and women who don't cover, more importantly? What those women who don't cover, what do you perceive them to be? Easy, available, there's no boundaries. And what are we saying to our society? In that, we don't have equality within these communities, and it's
so the
okay.
idea is that actually we are normalising almost the sacrificing of very young Muslim girls. They and they alone are the people who are allowed to be removed from their swimming classes, removed from their music classes, not PE classes, not allowed to be part of the class without hiding their hair, etc. It's actually normalising a kind of isolation of them in a way.
And state sanction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the crisis of the liberal state comes into it. Because I think, I don't know what you think about this, I don't know what most people think about this, but I think that certainly in a state school, that institution has a duty to preserve the freedom of choice of a child.
Absolutely.
To make sure they grow up with options, with different experiences, with exposure to different beliefs, because that's what, for me, the liberal democratic state does. It protects people's freedom to choose. And
basic human rights.
Which is a basic human right. Which is a basic human right. So every child has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, religion, and belief. And if the interesting crisis that we're in now is that we don't know where to draw that line, or we're not brave enough to say that line has been crossed by a parent in respect of their child, even when that child's in a state school. And I think that's a big untalked about principle.
But of course there was that school, the primary school, St Stephen's, where they did say actually we're not going to have.
But I don't think, and that was good, but I don't think it was expressed in those terms.
So just to say that school said we're not going to have children wearing headscarves within our schools.
For under 8s. Listen to what we say. We're talking about babies, young children, under 8s. School says that we're not having it. They get a huge mass organised lobby, organised by these mullahs. Groups.
And the school didn't give a good account of why they weren't having it either. I think if they'd said, listen, these children are in our charge and that it's our duty to keep
But they weren't
supported.
And what they do the moment they leave.
They weren't supported by the politicians. The Labour politicians, their local Labour politicians didn't support them. The education department didn't support them. They were left out to dry.
Did Ofsted support them? Because
Ofsted were the only one that did support them.
The chief inspector gave a speech in which she referred to. She's been quite good. I mean, that's one glimmer of hope, actually, is that we've had to wait until under this government, the coalition, and now this present government, for what glimmers of hope there have been, I think.
But
she's an inspectorate, so she has they can only go and inspect. They don't direct policy. They can't enforce. Whereas the I'm absolutely livid by the lack of direction from the Department of Education, because on the one hand you have the Department of Education, the ministers that are completely derelict in their duty in terms of protecting these young children. On the one hand saying, well, it's nothing to do with this individual school's policy, do you know what I mean, blah blah blah. And on the other hand you have the Home Office saying, oh, we must have cohesion, we must have integration,
exactly.
We've got these problems in our communities, why are we not talking about them, why are we not doing anything? Well, you're contradicting yourselves as a government, so how the hell do you think
when government did try and produce guidance on uniform, which is what, 2007, 8, 9, something like that anyway, it's been withdrawn now anyway, it was a complete hopeless mess. I mean, they really consulted, I think, the Muslim Council of Britain, one or two other organisations, and hardly anybody else.
Oh, I get so frustrated with this, and I really welcome the opportunity to say this, and so just forgive me if I don't quite articulate it well. But it makes me really cross, because it's so obvious. It's so obvious what they're doing. You have this group, and to be charitable, they were trying to pick a difficult topic. But actually, who is pushing for the word Islamophobia? It isn't secular Muslims, it isn't liberal Muslims, it isn't liberal Britain. It is conservative Islam that is pushing for this term to be used, Islamophobia. And the media use it because it's easy. And we know the media will use anything that's easy, do you know what I mean? But why is anti-Muslim hatred or anti-Muslim acts not good enough? Why is Islamophobia the word that they're picking on? That's the first thing I would say.
And people's fear about Islamophobia, about the term Islamophobia, is where is the line between criticising religion, which is totally legitimate, and basically being horrible to people because they happen to be Muslim.
Yeah. Well, it's a contradiction. It's a contradiction. You can't talk about anti-Muslim hatred and then mix it with anti-Islam, because they are two different things, and that's why people have such a problem with Islamophobia. I don't use it because you're talking about a phobia of religion. A phobia of religion is perfectly rational.
Well,
there's nothing wrong with that.
If
you want to
fine.
argue that,
it's certainly allowed, particularly in liberal Britain.
It's allowed. And when I say it's rational, I mean that in the sense of it's allowed, and you're allowed to believe that.
Yeah,
and it
it's
doesn't
a
mean that you're a
rational
bigot.
option.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It means that you're just making a choice. I don't necessarily agree with people being phobic about religion, but I can understand that people should have that right to.
The section of the Public Order Act that relates to religious hatred does this really well, admittedly because of a government defeat. I think it was the one where Tony Blair failed to turn up, and so there was a defeat by like 1 vote or something. I was involved in that in my early days of working at Humanists UK, because it was one of our parliamentary lobbies was to have an amendment that would defend free speech in the religious hatred law provisions, and it did. So what you ended up with in the religious hatred law of this country is that you can't whip up hatred against people based on their religion, but there's a whole category of things which are exempted, which is free debate of ideas, discussion of, and there's never been a prosecution under that law as a result. And I think that a successful prosecution under that law as a result. And I think that that's the right way of dealing with it. It's not black and white, is it? It's not Muslims want to do this and non-Muslims are trying to stop them. If you were an alien visiting this planet and just picking up a newspaper or even listening to a politician's speech or seeing the backlash against Amanda Spielman's comments, that's what you would think. You would think that there are Muslims who want to do these things to exercise their freedom, and then there are non-Muslims who are trying to stop them. You wouldn't think that there are some Muslims who think this, some Muslims who think that, other Muslims who feel pressured, other Muslims who want to take a different view. You wouldn't think that at all, would you? And that's invisible, and that needs to be more prominent in the media.
My frustration is that the evidence is there. This is, when you sit there and you have people on, I was going to name a media program, but I won't, out of fairness. But when you have people on these chat shows in the mornings, in the chat shows in the mornings where you have somebody from the ridiculous Muller's organisations there saying, we believe this and we believe that. They don't have an opposing view, for one. But secondly, that journalist doesn't actually push back and say, okay, then what's your view on child marriage? What's your view on gay rights? What's your view on
stoning to death?
Yeah. Actually putting it to them
I
directly.
only know one, Nicky Campbell. I'm going to name a name because it's a positive thing. He's often very good on this. He's a rare example of someone who's taken an active interest in a field and sort of developed his own knowledge, and that's rare in the media.
When those questions are asked, my kind of experience of them is people tend to say, well, I believe that you should follow the laws of the country that you're in. And so that's a way of saying, if I was in Saudi Arabia, I would follow the Saudi Arabian laws, but I'm in Britain, so I follow these ones.
But it's not just about the laws, it's about the social and cultural.
But it's not a straight answer.
No, it's not a straight answer. And they should unpick it. And these people, these journalists are clever. They're not stupid. They should unpick it. They say, okay, then that's fine. You follow. We all believe in the law of the land. What about the social and cultural norms of this country? What do you
actually think about this?
What do you think about this? But why, if you're Muslim Council of Britain, why are you not lobbying for your mosque to not have separate entrances for males and females? You would never cancel that for black people, for gay people. It'd be horrific, rightly so. Why are you saying it's okay for your religious institutions to do this? Why are the Islamic schools pushing for uniform codes that are regressive for females? Why are you tolerating this? So the evidence is there, but our politicians and the people in power that could do something are not pushing back. My frustration is that if this was a group of, say, let's Amish, of another Orthodox group, let's take a Christian Orthodox group, an Amish group, I would bet my last pound from, that I had in my purse, that the media, the politicians would not tolerate this. They would not tolerate a Christian group doing the same thing. They would not tolerate a Christian sect turning around and saying, we want our girls to be covered up, and we want separate entrances for our women in our mosque, and we want to segregate our events, and we believe this and this, because they're very similar actually.
So
in terms of practical things.
why would they not accept that, but why do they accept it from within the Muslim community? What is it that stops people confronting this properly?
It's a combination of things. One is fear, because
what's the fear?
Charlie Hebdo, other terrorist attacks. Unfortunately, the issue around free speech and being attacked. Salman Rushdie, Ali,
Van Gogh,
Ali,
Hersey Ali,
People are. I think people are scared, and that's a legitimate fear.
But
the other thing is, it's fear. It is an otherness. This is not our problem.
Yeah.
It's their problem. Then these are not our people ultimately. So actually let them sort it out themselves. And I think the third thing is, it's that actually it's just absolute cowardice. You know, it's collusion. It's about saying, well, you know what? We get what we need from these people, because it's much easier for a politician or for somebody in the media to turn around and say, right, here's this group. I've got this little checklist. I can phone them up. I can get this person on TV, rather than having to do a bit more extra work and having to go out into those
I think
communities.
there's also a misplaced generosity. I mean, you know, a sort of like, oh, this is there's racism in this country. There are people who are victims of racism. Therefore, we ought to do things. And I think you get that sort of paternalist, misplaced paternalist, together with the racism of low expectations that you mentioned earlier, which is also very important.
But my sense is that there has been a huge amount of self-censorship going on this issue, where people, I agree with you completely, where they have just felt scared to talk about it, but they haven't said that they felt scared to talk about it. So you've had this self-censorship, but it has been denied. And so it's been articulated in terms of what you're talking about, the benevolence, you know, the anti-racism,
But you think behind it all, it's fear?
I think behind a lot of it, there is fear. You know, for example, I know there was a big debate after the Charlie Hebdo murders about whether or not news programmes should show the pictures of the cartoons.
That was a rare example of people being honest about their fear, I think, because...
up to a point, a lot of people said, well, I don't think we should do it because it's disrespectful.
Yeah. A lot of people did say that, and they presumably believed that as well. I think some people did.
Some
people believed that, right? Although you might not believe it yourself, and it might be difficult to understand how people believe it. Some people just do believe that. They believe that.
I do believe that, but that was surely one part of the response.
And then you had other media organisations in particular who were honest about their fear, but honest about their fear in a slightly depersonalised way, because they would say things like, we have our staff to consider.
Yeah.
You know, we have women and men on the reception desk who haven't decided to take a brave stand for journalism. They're just doing their job. You know, I think that there is fear. Sometimes that fear is also legitimate, and that is for your employees or whatever. In the case of the Charlie Hebdo affair, I think you did get people being honest, but I think you're right. A lot of the time, there is fear behind it. Maybe so generalised and non-specific and default now that it's not even nameable by the people who are feeling it, because it's just become normalised as the thing. You mustn't antagonise these people, but it is there. And even in the Charlie Hebdo, I mean, we decided to put some I mean, it's very personal for us. You know, Charlie Hebdo in France is very famous as a humanist publication, a secularist publication. They were our colleagues, you know, and humanist organisations around the world had very serious discussions about how and in what form they should republish, and what we should do to address this on. And we did publish some of the cartoons. And there was another argument as well, of course, which was that people should republish in those circumstances, because not just to be in solidarity, but also to shed light on what had actually happened. Because one of the ways in which Islamist extremism is encouraged is through lies. And as you know, there were lots of lies about what the cartoons had actually portrayed and so on. So on the general principle that, you know, more light on a subject is better than more darkness, we did publish some of the cartoons. But it isn't a decision. And it isn't a decision. Exactly. It is brave, unfortunately.
But it shouldn't be brave. But it shouldn't be. In a liberal,
we're
talking about liberal Britain, it shouldn't be brave. It shouldn't be brave that humanists had to stand up and say, look, actually, these are our values. We have to protect them. And we, you know, our fellow brothers and sisters have been killed in the name of protecting and just, you know, promoting their values, and just illustrating, you know, being creative about what they do. You know, it's a cartoon.
And maybe a better response would have been actually for as many publications as possible to publish it, print them, put them everywhere. You know, stop, make it, you know, challenge the taboos, challenge the idea. But instead, actually, I think maybe overall the impact of that was to limit, you know.
Would the government of Britain have done what the government of France did, which was provide emergency funding to, you know, protection to Charlie Hebdo so that it could go on publishing and exist? I mean, that's, you know.
I just don't have that faith they would, because we have the
I don't think it would either. I know that it's a discussion about conservative Islam, but if it's also a discussion about liberal Britain, I think we should say something about the weakness of liberal Britain and the sort of like the thinness and insecurity of liberal Britain as well, because, you know, conservative Islam wouldn't be making its headway in the ways that we're discussing if it weren't for you know, the other half of this topic debate. And I think that I've been thinking in my head, just since we were discussing it a moment ago, about the difference between, for example, the government of France and the government of Britain. And I think one of the problems with Britain, which we've seen recently in another sphere of our life, is that, you know, we don't have a very clear sense of what our state is for. We don't have a very clear sense of our constitution. We don't have a very clear sense of our political identity, of our civic values, of what we're, you know, what as a nation state we're in favour of. And I think
as
that,
we can tell by the president,
as we can tell, you know, in a
meltdown
variety
of government.
exactly, in a variety of areas, and every attempt to ever do something about that has sort of failed. Either it's been seen as slightly absurd, like, you know, Gordon Brown's British Statement of Values, or you know, the British values of the present government in the education system, or it's been the preserve of sort of constitutional geeks and nerds who have got no purchase on wider life. So, I mean, what is liberal Britain? What does that mean when you use that phrase? It's true that the majority of people in this country have small L liberal values, in that they're sort of laissez-faire, tolerant, sort of you do it if it's not harming you. You know, the vast majority of the British population signs up in opinion polls again and again to the proposition: if it's not harming anyone else, you do what you
Absolutely.
want. You know, and so that's true. There are liberal values in that sense. But is there a liberal Britain in the same way that there is, you know, a Republic of France that has particular values that people who are citizens can sign up to, or the United States, you know, and anywhere with a constitution and a sense of civic honesty? I think there isn't, obviously, plainly, and I think that is one of the problems as well. I remember in 2006 when we were working on the Equality Act, working the Equality Act with Humanists UK, and even then organisations like the MCV were beginning to use equality law and equality law concepts, you know, to defend really religious extremism. I don't know if that's something that
Yeah, and certainly from the report, and this is one of the things that, you know, you need to push back against, is that you have these groups that are very savvy, very media savvy, and put out press releases and, you know, have media contacts and get on the news and get on all the various outlets. But they're using the language of equality to push very regressive values and issues.
Such as, give us an example.
Such as this report for from the APPG on Muslims and Islamophobia. You know, they want to racialise Islamophobia so it becomes like anti-Semitism, which is quite offensive at many levels, because it's, you know, there's a very particular reason why, and you know, the Jewish people are a race of people, and it's a religion as well, and the identification and the bonds around that and the kinship around that are very, very particular for Jewish people. Islam is a very it's not a religion that has that hierarchy. It's not a racial religion. It's actually a very, very open and broad religion, and so it's a dishonesty again that is being pushed through. But there's an ignorance and a lack of knowledge between the powers that be about Islamic theology and Islamic practice, and that's part of the problem why we have this.
And then one of the things is you don't want journalists and politicians to have to be theologians in order to actually engage with this point.
Or the state to do that. You don't want the state.
You know, so actually you're saying, so no, forget about trying to be theological experts. What you need to be is holding the line on gender equality, on the rights of children, on human rights, etc. You know, let other people debate what's the right version of Islam or whatever. You know, and actually if you can hold the line on that, you're probably in quite a strong place for defending liberal Britain.
Absolutely. And if you follow the example of France that we said earlier on, and there's some people, you know, I think that is a really good model, actually. I think they get a bit extreme sometimes, you know, they get a bit silly and take it too far. Like the whole you can't cover yourself on the beach, which is just absurd. But actually, if you have strong sense of identity of your country, and you have a government that reinforces that and pushes back and says, look, these are our British values, these are our liberal values. Yes, you can do what you like privately, but in public spaces and in state-run spaces, we will hold that line. Then you have a much better, you have a much more cohesive society, you have a much more tolerant society, and you have a much more welcoming society.
Part of it, I think, is because politicians, if I think back to governments like the Blair government, every government's made mistakes in its own way. You know, they've all got it wrong, but they've got it wrong in different ways. What the Blair government wanted, I think, was people to talk to. You know, community leaders was the phrase, and so what they look for is a sort of Church of England hierarch-style equivalent within the Muslim community. So they needed, people who were in charge of things, people who were in charge of buildings. And of course they found leaders, exactly.
Who are men. Community leaders who are men.
Of course, exactly. So instantly, they're all men.
They're all men. But Andrew, and the one thing I just want to say on that as well about the Blair government was that he also was a great pusher of faith schools, which has propagated the problem because they're unregulated. In the same way that state schools are.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, when And also has that's a way in which politicians have gone even further than, as it were, Muslims themselves, because there's evidence, as we all know, the majority of Muslim parents don't have any particular desire to send their children to an Islamic school, sometimes quite strong desire the other way. But the Blair government in particular was so fanatical in its push for religious schools that it was forcing the issue again and again and again. I mean, it ended up trying to get Sikh schools and Hindu schools, which zero Sikhs and Hindus wanted. You know, they had to search really hard before they found Sikh. At that point. Exactly, and at that point, and that's the pivotal phrase, isn't it? Because once it starts being offered, and once an industry for starting these schools comes about, then suddenly you create the demand. And I think that's right. I think that's the Blair government that created the demand for Muslim faith schools.
Why do you think that happened? Because I mean, I presume that no one was approaching this with an idea of, okay, great, let's segregate. You know, let's put people into different faith boxes and divide up our society. Do you think there was a certain element of naivety about thinking that that all faith schools would essentially be the same? Because there's a big difference between a sort of local Church of England school, which is basically broadly, I would suggest, you know, pretty kind of liberal.
There are plenty of people whose experience is different from that.
Yeah, that's fair enough. That's fair enough.
And particularly the further remote you go in Scotland, I mean, you get some real fundamentals.
Exactly. I mean,
but they're quite different from, say, the Orthodox Jewish schools and the hardline Islamic schools, you know, where girls are covered head to toe,
or segregated as soon as they come into the class, like that case in Birmingham with the Al-Hijra school. You know, that becomes, or the uniform policies that the girls have to be completely covered up. I mean, it's explicit. They don't hide, and yet somehow and it's
legal.
And it's legal.
Legal because it's a faith school in a way that it wouldn't be in a non-faith school.
So I wish. You know, I know we mentioned Tony Blair earlier on, and, you know, I'm actually a great fan of Tony Blair, and, you know, he did great. There's a lot of good that he did in government, and I wish that when they were pushing for this openness of more religious schools, that they had advisors that says, look, you can, if you want to pursue that policy, that's fine, but these are possible consequences, and you should hold British values, and they shouldn't be compromised by the, you know, for the view that we should have a religious freedom, unfettered religious freedom. Were people naive? I think there was some naivety, but actually I think part of it was deliberate. Part of it was, let's organise these people who are seen as other, because they're not seen as ours, because if they were seen as ours, you wouldn't need to organise them, because they'd already be in some kind of society, you know, in church or just people, you know, because you don't have organisations of white groups or Christian groups. You have the Christian faith lobby, but the generic, everyday, ordinary British person doesn't care.
Doesn't get labelled into that category.
But Muslims, if you're Muslim, it's like, okay, what Muslim are you? A Sunni? Are you Shia? Are you Ahmadi? Are you this? Are you that? Suddenly you have to. I've had journalists ask me, well, are you liberal? Are you secular? I'm like, are you practicing? I'm like, what do you know about practicing or not?
I agree with that. I don't think it was naivety. It wasn't naivety. It was deliberate. It was a deliberate way of dealing with what's perceived as, if not a social problem, then a social phenomenon, and saying, right, you know, we've got to, like you say, organise things.
We've got to organise
and these people need to, you know, go here and go there. And so governments, especially the Blair government, got very, you know, interested in whether a brown person was a Hindu, a Sikh, or a Muslim. And that was, I mean, when they introduced the census question on the census, you know, the first trial question was, are you any of these things, Hindu, Sikh, or Muslim? They didn't even pretend that it was about anything broader than that.
But there was an awful lot of the pushes for that comes from, like, within the liberal left, I think, that is trying to... they would see it as a positive way.
It was seen as a gift. A positive way of embracing this group.
We are recognising that people are from, you know, have different identities. And
I don't mean organising in a negative way. I think that a lot of the people who were pushing this thought this was an extremely beneficent thing to do. You know, it's only fair that we've got church schools, you know, we should have Muslim schools, and all the Muslims should go to Muslim schools, you know.
But it's the bigotry of low expectations, because it's suddenly you can't identify with anything but that. And there were people that were lobbying within that. There was groups, there's, you know, these you know, Muslim, I call them the mullahs, men's and women, because I can't see them as anything else, because they, you know, these are organised groups that have charitable status, that get funding from public bodies and that are not scrutinised, that lobby for the Muslim. You know, one of them actually has on their website that we are advocating for, you know, for the Muslim identity. What does that mean? What Muslim identity? Whose Muslim identity? Based on, you know, the 3-point-something million Muslims that you've surveyed. Also think about votes, and this is one of the things that we're not talking about.
Okay.
Actually, part of the reason of organising is because when you, when you politically campaign, you organise, and part of organising these other people, these other individuals in our or communities in our societies that we don't quite understand, but they are here and they're settled, because we're talking fifth generation now. My children's and their younger peers, there's a fifth generation. We're not talking about new migrants, we're talking about settled communities who are still being organised in this way. And part of that, because it's easy to get a community leader to go to his mosque or go to his community centre and say, right, I can deliver you 2,000 votes.
And so people don't want to rock the boat, politicians don't want to rock the boat. With,
absolutely, categorically. I've had politicians to my face tell me this.
Especially Labour politicians.
Especially Labour politicians.
And the analogy there is with the way that the Catholic vote went for Labour over successive decades. And I think that the Labour Party in particular, and its machinery on the ground, thought here is the same thing as the Catholics. You know, this is a community that is ours, but we must hang on to it, and in order to do so, we must foster its community institutions, treat them in this way, and then go to that nice man who is responsible for this mosque, so he can go down every house in this street and make sure they've got the Labour poster up.
Who's responsible for this community? Who's responsible for this street?
Because gatekeepers, really.
Yeah, because the thing is, if you're really interested in about some of the inequalities within those issues, why would we still have forced marriage being such an issue up until recently, and legislation being put in place? Why would we have had FGM still being an issue? I remember in the 90s campaigning on those issues, and people were just like, police, social workers, educationalists, politicians, it's not our problem. Supplementary schools are not regulated in this country. They're not regulated.
So you're talking about like Saturday schools?
Saturday schools, Sunday
Evening.
schools, evening schools, madrasa schools, etc. Now, the largest proportion of those are the Islamic schools, because it's one of the largest groups, apart from the Sunday schools or whatever. The reason why we can't get them regulated is because the Church of England pushes back every single time. Right. Now, the Church of England, in terms of the Reformation of Christianity, has happened, so we haven't got, there's not a massive issue like we already said. But because the Church of England will refuse to have them regulated, what happens is that we have all these other schools where there may be potential issues around social cohesion not being regulated, and those messages that they're being pushed through to those young kids that are unmonitored. That's a problem. And but people are not connecting those two things.
This is the problem about the fundamental structural problem in Britain that you mentioned earlier, that it just does not get discussed. And it's even by activists as informed as yourself, Nora, who was glibly dismissed the idea that anything to do with the Church of England is a problem, when in fact it's fundamental to the place of religion in politics and society in Britain.
Having them in the House of Lords,
exactly. It's the 8th richest NGO in the world. It's the 2nd biggest landowner in this country. It has 26 representatives in Parliament. It runs a third of our public schools. It is the template and the prototype and the paradigm of how you deal with religion in this nation state. And so, of course, every religious group, including the ones that are large, exactly.
I'm an eternal optimist. So my hope is that the people of Britain will, I think we're sensible people. We're a sensible nation in many ways, even despite what's going on currently. But we are lacking leadership. But I think that my hope is that we will get that pushed through, and eventually we'll come out the other side and we'll be like, whoa, that was a bit of a rough ride, wasn't it? That's my hope. My experience is, I've had threats to my person and to my family. I've had to change the way that I behave. I'm very careful anywhere on social media, but I'm more cautious now. And people are not taking those things. And I've had less threats than some of the other women campaigners that I have. So the reality is that the groups, the mullahs, men and women groups that are getting funded, ordinary activists can't compete with that. Yeah. The only two groups, I think it's an absolute travesty that the only two groups that are national groups that are lobbying for secular Britain is the Humanists and the Secular Society.
I mean, I would like to see any politician stand up for the universality of human rights within the UK, human rights for women, human rights for Muslim women, human rights for children, and lay down a marker, even if it's just a rhetorical one, that it is the business of Britain, the government and all our public institutions, to guarantee freedom and fairness for everyone in society, and then actually to apply that, and not to omit from that definition children and women, who are the people who always seem to get omitted in practice from even declarations that are made like that in theory.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. And I would add that for me, the biggest you know, for my prediction, and I keep seeing this, which is a problem, and I hope it doesn't come true, but I see this point where it's going to get very, very violent and very dangerous because we're not dealing with these issues. And for me, the thing is that I want the politicians and the media who are propagating this extremism to actually consider the type of country that they want in 20 years, in 50 years, in 100 years, because that's the problem. It's not now. Is that we are sowing the seeds and we are already allowing these seeds to grow, where we're saying these things are untouchable and we can't talk about these issues. And are we a secular country? Or are we a religious country, a Church of England country? Because the Church of England needs to be honest about what they are colluding with.
Yeah.
The politicians need to be honest about what they're colluding with, and the public, ordinary everyday people, need to, I think, just be a bit more robust in holding people to account, because that's where it's impacting. It's those little girls in the streets. It's the parents that contact me and say, my little girls are being forced to wear hijab because they've been ridiculed because everybody's wearing it at that school and they're 8 years old. That's where the problem happens. So it's, if the people in power don't deal with this, I envisage a very bloody future, and that's what worries me.
Well, thank you both so much for taking part in this discussion and also for what you both do more broadly in this country. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Opportunity.